In colloquial language, we often use precision and accuracy interchangeably, but they mean very different things from a statistical standpoint. Precision is the consistency and reproducibility of a test and is also sometimes referred to as reliability, whereas accuracy is a measure of how close test measurements are to true values and is sometimes referred to as validity. A precise test may not be accurate, and an inaccurate test may not be precise. Let's look at some examples that illustrate this concept. Let's say you're throwing darts at this bullseye. You missed your target, but the average is in the center. So over the course of 6 darts, you have a lot of variation, but the average is on the money. This represents accuracy, but notice there's high variation in the dart locations, and none of them are at the center. Okay, let's try this again with a new handful of darts. You were listening to me and decided, hey, I'm going to make sure I have less variation in my shots. So now your darts are highly clustered, but in the wrong spot. This is high precision, very little variation, but low accuracy because you didn't really hit your target. Actually, you didn't even come close. So now we want to try again, and this time the darts are tight and centered, which means they're both accurate and precise. This is the goal of any test. Finally, this last diagram shows my attempt at dart throwing. It's wildly scattered and off-center. This is neither accurate nor precise and doesn't bode well for me actually winning any dart games, which is why I don't play darts. Now, when we look at random error, this is basically the enemy of precision. It reduces the consistency and reproducibility of a test. So here's your accurate and precise test under the influence of random error. On the other hand, systemic error reduces the accuracy of a test by consistently skewing results in a particular direction, and thereby reducing the validity of the test measurements. Okay, time for another practice question. A new rapid and portable salivary glucose meter for diabetics measures a patient's salivary glucose concentration to be 200, 201, and 1,008 micromolar on 3 independent measurements. Using a gold standard measurement technique, the same saliva sample is determined to have a glucose concentration of 50 micromolar. How would you describe this new test in terms of accuracy, precision, and error? So here the answer is D. This new device was consistent in 3 independent measurements, so it is precise. However, its results are more than 30% higher than the gold standard measurement, which means it's not accurate. A precise but inaccurate test would exhibit significant systematic error. So now let's start. Prevalence is the total number of cases in a given population at some time, divided by the total number at risk in that population at the same time. Now, the population at risk includes only people who could be afflicted by the disease. For example, if you're trying to quantify the prevalence of endometriosis in a community, only women would be included in the population at risk since men are not at risk for uterine diseases. The total number of cases includes both old as well as new cases. And remember, prevalence describes a single point in time. Now, the incidence of a disease is defined as the number of new cases in some given period of time, divided by the total population at risk during that same period. Thus, incidence describes new cases that occur in a time period, while prevalence describes all the cases at some given time point. Also, when calculating incidence, people who are not at risk for acquiring the disease, just like in prevalence, are omitted. However, this also includes people currently with the disease as well as people previously with the disease for conditions that cannot be acquired multiple times. So roughly speaking, prevalence is approximately equal to incidence times the disease duration. Thus, for chronic diseases like diabetes, the prevalence will be greater than the incidence because there are a larger number of existing cases. While for acute diseases like the common cold, prevalence is approximately equal to incidence because almost all of the cases are by definition new cases. Alright, so now we're going to talk about biases and study errors. Someone or something is biased. This means that one item or thing is favored over another without a due cause. Biases are a really fun topic to talk and learn about. And understanding the different types of biases that can occur in a study is moderately high yield and worth reviewing. So, for our purposes, bias is defined as a situation in which an outcome is systematically favored over another. It therefore causes a systematic error. So let's review this with a quick flash quiz. Do you recall what systematic error reduces? Great. Systematic error reduces the accuracy of a study. And this makes sense. If a bias induces a systematic error, and biases are situations where one item is favored without good reason, it follows that systematic error would reduce accuracy. Let's start with biases that can occur when recruiting participants for your study. Selection bias is the non-random assignment of subjects to study groups. For example, selection bias occurs if only hospitalized patients are used as a control group, or if the patients themselves decide which group to enter. Thus, each group is a non-representative sample. There are a few more specific examples of selection bias, such as Bergson's bias, which uses a study population selected from a hospital. Clearly, people in the hospital are not a healthy population compared to the general population. Another example is loss to follow-up or non-response bias, and this is a common cause of selection bias in many studies. In each of these situations, the patients in each group render the group non-random and thus non-generalizable. So how do you think that you could reduce this form of bias? There you go, make it random or truly randomize your study. You could also ensure an appropriate reference group, and these would all help to reduce selection bias. All right, so let's illustrate this a bit more. Let's say you're running an intensive weight loss and diet program. At the start, you've enrolled a group of people that want to take on your plan. You make this group of people exercise and diet, but some of these people won't make it to the end either because they can't maintain it or they don't think the plan is working. So at the end of your study, you've got some people who lost weight, some that didn't, and some that kind of fell in between. However, you've lost all of these people who may have not benefited from your program. And so you've excluded all of these data points that could have influenced your study. All right, so now let's talk about biases that occur while running the study. Recall bias is when the knowledge that a disorder is present affects the recall by subjects. For example, if patients are asked about past behaviors like smoking, especially during pregnancy, they may not remember or report them accurately. Hence, recall bias is common in retrospective studies. Sometimes, if you catch the population of interest close to the event, you can actually decrease recall bias. And that makes sense. Your ability to recall would be better closer to the event than further away. Measurement bias occurs when information is gathered in a way that distorts it. For example, the GPS on my phone always overestimates the distance I've run, but it keeps time perfectly. The result? I think I'm running a faster mile than I really am. Another example of measurement bias is the Hawthorne effect. This is when the person being studied actually changes their behavior because they know they're being observed. You might see this in an observational study looking at physical activity in cardiac disease. Participants are likely to increase activity because they believe it helps prevent disease. How do you combat this? You standardize the data collection method and add in placebo groups. Procedure bias occurs when subjects in different groups are not treated the same. For instance, more attention is paid to the treatment group, leading to greater compliance. So how do you avoid this? By blinding the researchers and the doctors administering the treatment. Observer expectancy bias is when the researcher's belief in a treatment actually changes the outcome. This has a name, the Pygmalion effect. It's a form of observer bias, and it can be avoided by having an independent observer interpret the outcomes. If this were to occur, what kind of blinding would help? There you go, a double-blinded study. Confounding bias happens when two associated factors confuse the results. The effects of extraneous factors muddle the exposure-disease relationship. It can be prevented by matching controls to cases so that they share the same characteristics, except for the factor of interest. An example here is alcohol and esophageal cancer. If a study aims to see if alcohol causes esophageal cancer, smoking could be a confounding factor. Why? Because smoking is associated with both alcohol use and esophageal cancer. Without controlling for both, you're open to confounding bias. Lead time bias occurs when early detection is mistaken for increased survival. The disease's natural history hasn't changed, but early detection makes survival look longer. Think about cancer screening for this type of bias. Link time bias happens when slowly progressive diseases are more likely to be detected, leading to overestimation of survival. For example, prostate cancer versus lung cancer. Prostate cancer progresses slowly, lung cancer doesn't. So early detection appears to help more with prostate cancer. Now, let's go over ways to reduce bias. Placebos, blinding, and crossover studies all help. In crossover studies, each subject acts as their own control. Group 1 gets the treatment, Group 2 gets placebo, and then later they switch. This method helps eliminate many types of bias. Randomization is also highly effective, especially against selection and confounding bias. And matching subjects so that groups differ by only one important variable. That's another good strategy. All right. It's hard to keep track of all these biases, so let's try an example. You want to know if heavy alcohol consumption increases the risk of bladder cancer. You conduct a prospective cohort study, compare drinkers to non-drinkers, and get a relative risk of 2.3 with a p-value less than 0.01. Are you satisfied that you've proven a causal link? What kind of bias could be present? A. Confounding bias. B. Lead time bias. C. Observer expectancy. D. Procedure bias. There you go. The answer is A. Confounding bias. Why? Because smoking is linked to both drinking and bladder cancer. So it could explain some or all of the observed association. Now we will discuss various terms that are used to describe statistical distribution. Let's start with the basics. There are several measures of central tendency, and these are likely familiar to you. They are the mean, median, and mode. The mean is simply an average, or the sum of all the values divided by the number of values in some dataset. The median is the middle number in a dataset when that dataset is organized from least to greatest. And lastly, the mode is the most common number in some given dataset. So let me ask you a few questions. Which of these numbers would be most affected by outliers? The answer here is the mean. Similarly, which of these would be least affected by outliers? The answer here is the mode. Now, which one of these statistical measures would be best discovered by charting a histogram? Again, the answer here is the mode. Now, what would you do if you were calculating the median and you had an even list of numbers? The answer here is to take the average of the middle two numbers. Moving on, we see that the normal or Gaussian statistical distribution is a bell-shaped curve and that the mean, median, and mode are all equal. The standard deviation is denoted by the lowercase Greek letter sigma and describes the spread of the data about the mean. So how would the standard deviation be affected in a very precise test? Well, it would be decreased, since the variation of the data is lower and the bell curve would be skinnier. However, precise tests may still not be accurate. Now, what would that look like? Well, it would be shifted. And the spread is low, but the result doesn't actually reflect the true population. As shown in this diagram for normally distributed data, 68% of the data falls within one standard deviation of the mean, 95% of the data falls within two standard deviations of the mean, and 99.7% of the data falls within three standard deviations of the mean. As an example, if the mean systolic blood pressure of a population is 130 with a standard deviation of 10, how many of a 100-member cohort will have blood pressures greater than 140, assuming a normal Gaussian distribution? So we can calculate those numbers as follows. We know that 140 is one standard deviation above the mean, and we know that 68% of the cohort or 68 members will have values within plus or minus 1 adult deviation of the mean. Thus, 32 members have values above 140 or below 120. 120 would be here. By symmetry, we can conclude that 16 members would have systolic blood pressures greater than 40, and another 16 would have systolic blood pressures less than 120. The standard error of the mean, or SEM, is defined as the standard deviation divided by the square root of the sample size. Understanding how standard error of the mean differs from standard deviation can be a little bit tricky. Let's assume that you have a population of interest, but you can't measure everyone in the population. What do? Well, you select a random sample of a certain size that you assume is representative of the population. You measure them and then find the sample mean. Okay? Now you put these people back into the population and take another random sample of the same size, and you calculate their sample mean. Now you can repeat this process as many times as you want. How precisely do these sample means reflect the true population mean? That is where standard error of the mean comes into play. The standard error of the mean measures the spread of the sample means about the true population mean. Recall that standard error of the mean is the standard deviation divided by the square root of the sample size. Therefore, as sample size increases, standard error of the mean decreases. Does this make sense? It should, because this tells us that as the sample gets larger, the sample means become better estimates of the true population mean. Now, is the standard deviation affected by sample size? The answer is no. The sample size has no effect on standard deviation, only on standard error of the mean. What is the effect of sample size on the standard error of the mean? As we said, standard error of the mean decreases as the sample size increases. Shifting gears now, let's talk about deviations from the normal distribution that we just discussed. Take a look at this bimodal distribution. What do you think would cause something like this? Well, you would see something like this when your data encompasses two different populations. And this is called a bimodal distribution. You might think of something like this when considering age of onset of certain cancers or suicide rates by age. A positive skew in a distribution occurs when there is asymmetry with the tail lying on the right. In these distributions, the mean is usually greater than the median, which in turn is typically greater than the mode. A negative skew in a distribution occurs when there's asymmetry, when the tail is on the left. In these distributions, the mean is usually less than the median, which in turn is typically less than the mode. What measurement is best used to make sense of a skewed distribution? In both positive and negative skewed distributions, the median is a better measure of central tendency than either the mean or the mode. Also, in all distributions, the mode is the most resistant to outliers in the sample, whereas the mean, standard deviation, variance, and the range of the distribution are all very sensitive to outliers. The median is only slightly more affected by outliers than the mode. If the reasons for these statements are not immediately clear, then you need to spend some time thinking about them based on the definitions of these statistical terms. Okay, let's do a quick flash quiz. Is this a positive or a negative skew? This is a positive skew, and we know that because the tail is on the right, and thus the mean is greater than the median and the mode. Let's try a practice question. A hospitalized patient has 10 consecutive measurements of their systolic blood pressure. Now, suppose the largest pressure measured is 125 millimeters mercury, and the lowest pressure measured is 115 millimeters mercury. If the next measurement is 180, which metric is most likely to remain unchanged? Well, using the approach that we just discussed, the mode, which is the most frequently observed data point, is the most resistant to outliers. All of the other metrics will be more sensitive to outliers and thus would be more likely to change.